everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Annie Karen, and I am an HR member here, a part of the AEM Workforce Solutions Group, and I'm here with Brenna Ramey.
Hello, everybody. Happy to be here today. We're excited to talk about some items and topics that Annie and I and our team, our own HR team was actually talking about. So we thought, hey, if our own team of HR consultants and internal managers is talking about how we use these regulations, our audience is certainly going to be asking the same questions and probably interested in learning what we learned too.
Yeah. So we want to talk about a couple of laws that just came out recently. The first one being the Fair Labor Standards Act overtime requirement. So Brenna, do you want to just start by telling us, maybe just back up and explain what the Fair Labor Standards Act is and what this new rule is?
Absolutely, yeah. The FLSA is their acronym for the Fair Labor Standards Act, and most HR professionals have heard FLSA before, and even I think a lot of small business owners or leaders have heard it. And really what the Fair Labor Standards Act does is it gives us the guideline on how employees are paid. And the really simple way of explaining it is it outlines who's eligible for overtime, who's not, what's a work week, when do we count overtime, and how does all of that pay stuff happen. And the FLSA is the most common way that you heard it, but it does, as you said, it stands for the Fair Labor Standards Act, and it just helps us employers know how to pay people.
Great. And I know two classifications under the FLSA is non-exempt versus exempt. And I know a lot of people kind of use non-exempt versus exempt, explaining it as hourly versus salary positions. Is that correct?
Yeah, Annie, I think that's actually one of the most common things that HR professionals do. And I even see handbooks all the time. Even myself, I've been in HR over 20 years, and I sometimes use those designations as well. And the reality is that they're actually different things. So exempt and non-exempt under the Fair Labor Standards Act really is how they define who's eligible for overtime and who's not. So if you are non-exempt, then under the Fair Labor Standards Act, it's been determined that you will receive and are eligible for overtime for any hours worked over 40 hours per week. And the designation of exempt under the FLSA means that you are exempt from that overtime pay, meaning if you're an exempt employee and you work 50 hours a week or 40 hours a week, your pay is the same. And while it's really common to use hourly and salaried, and many times they are and could be interchangeable, when you really get down to the specific language of those legal definitions, they actually are different. And we're just always really encouraging everybody we interact with to really get in the habit and practice of using non-exempt and exempt instead of hourly and salaried. And a simple example of why you want to do that is that there are scenarios where somebody may be paid a weekly or annual salary because the employer says this is how we're going to pay you, but they could still be eligible for overtime over that 40 hours per week. So they seem interchangeable, they aren't, and it's just a great habit and practice to get into using those legal definitions of non-exempt and exempt.
Awesome. Thanks for clarifying that. I think that's helpful for everyone to know. I'm guilty myself of doing that sometimes.
Like
so
I said,
good
me too.
reminder.
It's an easy thing to do.
Yeah. Great. So before we get more into the law that just came out, tell me, for example, if I'm a small employer, maybe with 5 or less employees, should I care about this update to the law, or does it even apply to me?
That's a great question. And I think a lot of employers, particularly really small employers who maybe don't have a learned HR professional in-house, assume this falls into the bucket of things where in Minnesota, a lot of our laws and a lot of the federal laws don't kick in until you have 10, 15, 21, or 50 employees, or maybe it's based on gross sales. And this is one of those laws that very explicitly does apply to all employers. And particularly the Minnesota Department of Labor actually puts out specific language. And they say that all firms must pay Minnesota's overtime wage regardless of a size, location, sales, method of compensation. It actually says that designations such as part-time, temporary, seasonal, none of those matter. And no matter your size, you need to pay those. Particularly, I think this is applicable in what we see a lot with small businesses is they kind of create titles and job functions, and because everybody's doing a little bit of everything, they think they can call everybody exempt. And so we're just always encouraging everybody to just really be aware and knowledgeable of what those standards are, because it does apply to everybody regardless of your size.
Great. Yeah. So now that we've established that it does indeed apply to all sized employers, what does this mean for all employers? What does this primarily affect?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the first regulation that got published in September, that's an update, and it went effective on January 1st, was an update to the FLSA overtime rule in how we determine people's exemption status. So the FLSA, if you look at that as a big umbrella, gives employers and employees, for that matter, kind of a guideline on how do we determine who's eligible for overtime and who's not, and how does that pay get calculated. And those guidelines, a couple of years ago, there was a big push to get them updated, and there was a lot of pushback, and so it got pushed off. And a final rule was published in September for effective January 1st that updated parts of that. And the most significant update under that was an update to the minimum salary threshold. And the easiest way to explain that is just to uncomplicate it and say that everything else doesn't even become a point of conversation, and you don't even need to look at it until an employee is paid that minimum salary threshold. And the new threshold is now $35,568 per year, or essentially $684 a week. And what that means that no matter what your title is, no matter what your job duties are, no matter what your hours of work are, if you don't get paid a minimum of $35,568 a year or $685 a week, that you cannot be considered exempt from overtime. And that just was updated and effective January 1st, which is the most significant one. They also updated their highly compensated employees, which the difference between the minimum and the highly compensated, you might hear it called the HCE, is that the minimum salary just gets you in the door for having the conversation around all of the other exemption buckets. So you have a minimum salary. As an employer, then you still have to go through the process of determining, do the job duties meet the exemptions test? The highly compensated employee number means that you really don't have to go through that full process if they meet that number. So there are two different numbers with different kind of sides of the coin, but both matter.
Great. Perfect. Well, I know in addition to everything you just covered, there's also another update that just came out from the Department of Labor relating to regular rate of pay. What can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, I will. And I would say that even as a, I have my degree in human resources. I've been in HR for, like I said, almost 20 years. And the regular rate of pay stumps even the most experienced HR people. So I would say this is something that we see done incorrectly a lot. And what we're really excited about is the Department of Labor gave us some clarity on that and really helped define it. So when you talk about regular rate of pay, that is different than hourly rate of pay. So under the FLSA, we talk about eligible for overtime or not eligible for overtime. Regular rate of pay, as it relates to employees who are eligible for overtime pay, is the rate that you use when you're calculating that time and 1/2 for anything over 40 hours a week. So, for example, let's say an employee is hired at $10 an hour. A common misconception that employers will tell us is, oh, well, we're paying time and 1/2 at that $10 per hour. But the FLSA is clear that you need to be paying time and 1/2 at regular rate of pay. And what that needs to include, they give us a really clear definition of that, is all compensation provided to an employee as a part of their employment. So, for example, things that we know have to be included are bonuses, incentives, commissions, and things that actually are related to their job performance. And how you calculate that, there is a very clear process on that, which we could help anybody with, and/or we'll give some resources for how to get that answer. But the regular rate of pay is different than the hourly rate of pay. And that's what was recently updated.
Great. And in addition to things that should be included in the regular rate of pay, do you have some examples of things that should be excluded from the regular rate of pay?
Yes, I do, Annie, and it's a celebration because this is the first time in 50 years that the Department of Labor has updated the language around this regulation. And what they did is they published a guide on rulemaking to help employers understand that. So you can imagine 50 years ago when they published this regular rate of pay, there were a lot fewer incentive programs and extras that employers were offering. But a lot of employers offer a lot of extras now. And there's been, for a long time, a lot of gray area and even some cases working through the court system that are challenging and asking what it has to be included in regular rate of pay. So what's great is the Department of Labor gave a ton of clarity around what explicitly does not have to be included in regular rate of pay. Things like compensation for meal periods, discounts on hotel rooms and travel, the cost of snacks, drinks, and meals on special occasions, not everyday meals, but special occasion ones, parking spaces, accident, unemployment, and legal benefits, payouts of unused vacation and sick leave, holiday pay, all of those things now we know explicitly do not have to be counted when you're looking at the regular rate of pay, which we know that some employers have really held off on adding programs in out of concern for, am I going to have to count this into my regular rate of pay? Is that going to increase my overtime costs? And does it complicate the process? So there's now a great time to look and say, hey, what can we add in, knowing that we can have this incentive and not have an impact from it?
Great. Thanks so much for clarifying that, Brenna. Well, I think we just covered a lot of information in a short amount of time. So why don't you just recap and share some of the key takeaways that employers should take away from these two updates?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the two main things that I would encourage anybody who is involved with pay at their business to look at is, one, if you haven't reviewed what your base minimum salary is for any of your overtime eligible employees and non-overtime eligible employees. So we have exempt and non-exempt. Make sure all of your exempt employees meet that minimum salary. And if you haven't done a review of how you're classifying people in exempt and non-exempt, now is a great time to do that. And then also, if you don't feel confident that you're calculating your regular rate of pay differently than just straight hourly pay, it's a great time to look at that. What a great catalyst to make sure you're doing that correctly. And then also, if you weren't including programs because you weren't sure how that would impact your regular rate of pay, now is a great time to add those in.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much again for sharing that information. I know I found it helpful. Hopefully you have all found this helpful as well. So we just want to say thank you so much for listening today, and we look forward to talking to you all next time.
Yeah, thank you. I had a great time, and I just want to say one last thing that if you haven't visited the Department of Labor websites recently, it's a great time to go there, and you can get a ton of information beyond what we talked about today on these two specific topics. So we've really touched on a very high level on them, and you can imagine the details of them, Annie, and they go on for pages. So you can get all of those very specific pieces of information at the Federal Department of Labor and also the Minnesota Department of Labor.
Awesome. Thanks so much for sharing those resources, Brenna. Thanks again for listening, and have a great rest of your day.